Oh, it's over. Okay. Irish. Yeah. All righty. There she is. Continuing talking about, or my talk about, Women's History Month. I want to talk about this lady, who is appropriate also to the day to extend the idea of St. Patrick's in Ireland, because she's Irish, of Irish descent. Julia Teresa Tallon. Julia Teresa Tallon. Servant of God. She's at the beginning stages of her journey to possible sainthood. There's a picture of her. 1867 till 1954. 1954 is when she lived. She was born in New York City to Irish immigrants. And so she grew up Catholic. And apparently she wanted to become a nun, but her parents didn't want her to, especially her mom, even though they were devout Catholics apparently, but they just didn't want her to become a sister. Maybe because they wanted grandkids or something, and they knew that wasn't going to happen if she became a nun, but whatever. She did become a nun. She joined the Holy Cross Sisters in, 1887. And lived with the order. And then later on, she felt called to found her own order, which she did, called the Parish Visitors of Mary Immaculate. She did that in 1920. And I'm assuming, I've heard of these groups before, parish visitors. I think they're like sisters who would visit people's homes, like shut-ins, people who couldn't go out, maybe they're disabled or something. And, they show up and they maybe clean the house for the person or cook them a meal or just sit with them and talk and whatever. But they're visitors, like the name says. They go out and visit people. But that's their ministry as nuns, as sisters. All right. For the last 20 years of her life, she apparently had disabling illnesses, but I don't know what. I'd have to dig deeper to find out what she had. But anyway, she had apparently disabling illnesses, but she didn't tell anybody about them except people who were close to her. But finally, in 1954, she fell in her room, and that was kind of the end of her. Which, it makes sense it happens with elderly people. If they're doing fine and then they fall down and they break something or they get the flu and, the whole system then just breaks down for some reason. The body just decides well, I'm already hurt, so I might as well die for some. Not necessarily, because I thought the Pope was dying and the old bugger is still going, so... hopefully for many years, but we'll see. But he was really sick there for a while. But she fell down and then, she just never recovered. So she died. So in 2013, she was recognized as a holy woman by Pope Benedict XVI. And so she's now a servant of God and is on her way to sainthood. So I asked this Irish-American woman, a servant of God, Julia Tallon, to please pray for us, especially not today, but yesterday was St. Patrick's Day. And that will be blessed in the course that we're taking. What are those, seeds or something? Mr. Prinzio, seeds? Oh, interesting. Okay, back to the Jews. Where did we end? We ended Tetragrammaton, right? Whoops. I'm coming to that. Okay, I was talking about this Tetragrammaton, the name of God, I am who am. All right, is there anything more I want to say? Okay, no, I'm moving on. Covenant. Remember, the two main ideas of Judaism to remember are monotheism, one God, and election, that they've been chosen by God and have entered in a special contract with God. So the covenant, and that's what we're going to talk about today. The covenant, which is the name for the unique and singular relationship existing between God and Abraham of Ur. I don't know why I put that on there, but anyways, Abraham and his descendants. Abraham and his descendants. Oh, remember we have a quiz this week, right? So if you haven't done the quiz, please finish the quiz by Friday, please. And, we have, minor project number 3 coming up too in a week or so. So make sure you do that, and I will try to make my grading of you more reflective of the work you're putting into it. Understand what I'm saying? Because I know some of you are putting in a lot of work, and so I'm a hard grader, but I'll try to be aware of that, aware of the work that you're putting into it, okay? Okay. Moving on. The covenant. The covenant. A covenant itself is simply a contract or an agreement, okay, from 2 Latin words, cum, venio, to come together or coming together. In Hebrew, it's called a berit, which means a bond or a chain. So a link, it links you together. Nothing religious about the term. It's a berit can be used of any sort of contract, any kind of contract between partners, covenant, but it's used specifically in this sense as this unique contract or agreement that's made between God and the Jewish people, starting with their descendant Abram or Abraham, who I've talked about before. Ur is the city where he supposedly came from in southern Iraq, in Mesopotamia. Okay, that's what Ur is doing here. Sometimes called Abram of Ur. Okay. Anything I want to say about that? Maybe I'll mention that. We'll see if I come to it. So the belief, the covenant expresses the belief, the affirmation of Judaism that God has a special relationship with this man Abraham, his family figure, okay, the father of a family, eventually a family, and his descendants, but especially through his descendant Jacob, his grandson Jacob, Israel. And so this is one of those things that lies at the heart of the Jewish religion, right? And there are a number of covenants mentioned in the Bible, probably because some were inserted later on. There was, even with Abraham, probably scholars think that maybe they reinserted this idea of a covenant with Abraham. It actually comes from this man Moses we'll talk about. But anyways, whatever. You find several covenants, several iterations of this covenant idea appearing in the Jewish sacred writings with different people. They all have kind of different ideas behind them. Okay, with Abram or Abraham, it's the same difference, same name, just a different spelling. If you want to look up his story or the essential stories of the promises, the covenants God makes with him, you can look in the book of Genesis and the Jewish scriptures and those chapters. But what is the covenant with him? God promises Abraham that he's going to give him land, a place to live. Oh, did I want to say that? I'll come back to it. He's going to give him a family. He's going to give him descendants. And that God will establish a unique relationship with him. That God will be the only God that his family will worship. In response, because there's always 2 sides to an agreement, I'll do this for you, but then I want this from you. I'll do this for you, but then you do this for me. The obligations of the covenant that Abram and his descendants will be faithful in worshiping this one God, faithfulness to the terms of the covenant. They would do what they were supposed to do. They would obey God and what he told them to do. And they would worship him alone. And the one practical thing that God tells Abram that he has to do is to circumcise. This will be a sign of this, the essential sign of this agreement between God and Abram. You see your definition of circumcision. Circum in Latin means around, like a circle is round. Okay, and a circus is in the round. And chizo, from chado in Latin means to cut, so to cut around. So cutting around the foreskin of the penis, circumcision. So you're supposed to remove the foreskin of the penis to indicate physically the terms that you're binding yourself, berit, to the terms of this agreement. Now, this idea of covenant, I'm backtracking a little bit because I skipped over in my notes. I apologize. This idea of a covenant, as I said, there's nothing necessarily religious about it. And even the covenant idea, it's not unique to Israel or to the Jews. Okay, it's found throughout the ancient Near East. Okay, the whole locale that the Judaism arose in. Okay, you have an agreement that is sworn, in which you have obligations in the agreement. As I said, I do this for you, you do this you're supposed to do this for me. We swear before witnesses so people can verify that we actually swore to these, said we would do these things. Especially the witnesses are the gods, so gods are invoked. Because, human witnesses can die, they can forget, they can lie, but the gods won't. The gods won't forget. And the gods will punish if the person breaks the terms of the covenant. And attached to these agreements were usually blessings and curses that if you fulfill the terms, we'll do this, this will happen to you, good things. If you don't, then certain curses will happen to you, Your women will go barren and have no children. Your animals, your farm animals will die. Your crops will rot on the vine, all this sort of stuff. And then it was topped off with a meal. You would have a sacrifice an animal, and then you would eat it together to show finally this bond. There's nothing unusual about this. This still happens today. I mean, you can't reinvent the wheel in a way. It's just that the cultures have changed. But you still, when corporations or people are negotiating a contract, the contract says, this is what we're going to do for you. This is what you're going to do for us. There are witnesses who sign the contract to verify that, yes, they made these obligations. They did this. There are blessings and curses. It's like you have, whatchamacallit, not limits. What's the word I'm looking for? Benchmarks. Like if you reach these benchmarks of our contract, then we'll pay you X amount of dollars. If you don't, then we'll fine you and all this other stuff. So blessings and curses. And then everyone goes out to have, to the Applebee's to celebrate, and have well, not in your case, but in their case, drink a little drink and, a hamburger and something, a sacrificial meal. So, times have changed, but the actual making of a contract actually hasn't, in a way. But the covenant, what becomes novel about the covenant for this religion, for Judaism, is that the people, usually covenants, a god would make a covenant with the ruler of the people, the king. And we have examples of this from the archaeology of, like stone monuments showing the god giving the covenant to the king or the ruler of the people. But Judaism is different because it's the people themselves that God makes a covenant with. They don't have any ruler per se. God is their ruler in a manner of speaking, but he makes it with the whole community. All right. Next, we have this major figure called Moses. He may be the one where the idea of the covenant actually comes from, and then we're kind of retrojected into the other stories. But Moses, he's a major figure, as we know. He's a liberator of Semitic tribes from Egypt, and brings them up to the land of Canaan, where they settle. He also, some scholars think, he establishes the religion of Yahwism. Remember, we were talking about the name of God. I am who am. It comes from the Hebrew word for, Hawa. Go back and look on my PowerPoint. Go back, Dr. Gunn. Curious. Oops. Oh, Ehyeh, but that's not what I'm looking for. Do we have that? No, I didn't put that down. All right. Anyways, the Hebrew word which means to exist, I am, I exist because I exist. And a lot of people attribute Yahwism, the worship of this only one God, Yahweh, to Moses. This is something new that he brings to the other Semites who might have already been living in Canaan, worshiping other gods. But Moses arrives and said, no, you only worship this one God, Yahweh. And this God, Yahweh, has made a covenant with Moses. What is that covenant? The Lord as the only God, okay? So there's a little bit of a difference here. It's getting hot in here. Get hot? Whew. Man. There's a little bit of a difference here. Because whereas, with Abram, God is like the family God, the only God that Abram and his descendants will worship. But with Moses, Moses ups the ante. God is the only God that the whole Jews will worship. It's not just of the family of Abraham, but anyone related now to Abraham, coming from Abraham, the Lord is their only God as well. Even of the people that he brings up from Egypt, it's like they adopt the God of Abraham. Okay, even though they might not have originally been Israelites, but they adopt the God of Abraham. The law, God gives a law to this man Moses that's written down. And there are blessings and curses. Okay, victory over enemies, peace and prosperity if the Jews follow the law of Moses, or curses. Okay, so faithfulness to the covenant is a big deal. What are the obligations? What are the Jews supposed to do? Well, again, be faithful. So that's being kind of repeated. Kind of tells you something, Ms. Lane, about the Jews. That God has to keep saying, all right, remember, be faithful to me now, people. Be faithful. I'm not saying the Jews weren't faithful, but they are a rebellious people, according to the book of Ezekiel. Anyways, so again, be faithful to me and to my laws, follow my laws, obey my laws that I've given to Moses, and sacrifice, worship. Okay, an orderly system of worship is established with Moses. Basically killing, well, I shouldn't say it's only killing things, but yeah, a lot of killing of animals, goats, lambs, bulls, and offering up their blood and their meat to God, burning it up. But also offering grain offerings, grain and fruits and all sorts of other things to God and burning those up as well. For some reason, Miss Francis, God likes to eat a lot of bread. A lot of bread. You had to have the show bread in front of him every day. Like, was it 6 pieces of show bread that you had to have in front of him? Because he might get a little bit peckish, Ms. Oler. God bless you, sir. Anywho, so sacrifice. We'll talk about that. I'll talk about the Passover later. Well, I mentioned the Passover. It's not there. What is sacrifice? It's an act of offering up something to a supernatural being, usually by destroying it. So if you just offer something, that's an offering. Okay? So, if I go and, you see people in religions, like they'll go up to a statue and leave a piece of fruit or some kind of flower or something. They're just offering. It's just offered to the God or the spirit or the saint or whatever. But when you destroy the offering, when that's part of the process, you burn it up or you kill it, that's a sacrifice. You're making it holy. You're dedicating it. You're making it sacred. So you're making it dedicated to the God. Remember our definition of sacred, something dedicated to the gods or the spirits. And the thing about sacrifice is that you're doing the ultimate dedication because you're killing the thing. You're destroying it. You're taking life from it. It's not coming back. So once it's gone, it's gone. All right? So sacrifice. It's the difference between a simple offering, a mere offering, and a sacrificial offering. Is that destructive aspect, the ending of a life or something. Is it now getting chilly that I have the window open? Are you chilly? You're chilly? Mr. Prinzio. Because I'm boiling. All right. The Passover. This is where the Passover sacrifice comes into play. This is a major celebration. It's one of the signs of this Mosaic covenant that every year, year after year, the Jews honor the Exodus by celebrating the Passover ceremony. Okay, you see your definition there. It's a festival. They remember the time when God skipped over them, when one of the plagues of Egypt, the final plague, God sends his angel to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians, the oppressors, of both man and animal. So what do the poor animals do? What? The Jewish God takes no prisoners, baby. Don't piss them off. So kill not just your firstborn child, but the firstborn of your animals as well. And so when that happens, the Egyptians freak out, and they're like, okay, they tell the Jews or the Israelites, okay, get out of here, go away. You're too much trouble. You're causing us too much trouble. And so to remember this night when God's angel passed over the Jews and did not kill them, which, if they're God's people, why would he have killed them? Why would that have even been a question? Like, gotta protect ourselves. Okay, but just go with it. Go with the story. God passes over them. They honor this with the Passover, or as it's in Hebrew, Pesach, which means exactly the same thing, to pass over, Pesach, which comes from the Hebrew pasach, the Hebrew word, a verb, pasach, to hop. To hop, to skip. You can't skip. I'll get to you in a second. So what else does it mean? Hesitate, to dance. God dances through Egypt, killing off the firstborn and passing judgment on the gods of Egypt. Yes, Mr. Belfield.
Well, you said why wouldn't he kill his chosen people? But well, could it also have been a way to see if they're really faithful?
That's a good point. Yeah, see if they would follow his rules. Oh yeah, that's right. And that point is made later on when God's giving the law to Moses. He says, "I'm giving them these laws because I want to see who's going to obey them." So yeah, no, you're right. So he tells the Jews they have to smear the blood of the lamb sacrifice if the lamb they're gonna sacrifice or the goat. Smear the blood of the animal on the doorpost, so the angel will see the blood and know it's a Jewish home or an Israelite home. Yeah, so there's even faith. Yeah, that's a good point. So the Pesach, the Passover, becomes a celebration of this covenant. I guess I'll give the details later. I'm going to talk about, I do talk about the Passover later, or do I not talk about it? I think I talk about the Sabbath, but I don't talk about the Passover. Sometimes I just have to trust my notes. Okay. The Passover usually happens, I shouldn't say usually, it does happen in springtime. So, it's coming up. It's coming around the time that Christians celebrate Easter, because Christian Easter is dated by the celebration of the Jewish Passover. So I think around the middle of April is when the Passover is this year for Jews. It's the first of their months, or it's the first month of at least their liturgical or worship calendar. I think the civil calendar is Rosh Hashanah, which is in the fall. But the springtime is when, at least in their worship calendar, they begin with the Exodus. It's the first month of their religious calendar. It's the best known of all their festivals. And it really is a special meal that's held at home. These are you see the tables, that's a picture of a table set up for the Passover. You have special silverware and special plates and all sorts of things, that special cups, because there are all sorts of instances where you drink a cup of wine, all sorts of different toasts, blessings of God during the ceremony. You eat flat bread or unleavened bread. No one knows why. The theory is that the Israelites had to leave in such a hurry from Egypt. They were not able to wait for the bread to rise, so they couldn't add any leavening agent to it. So they just took what they had, which was flat bread, unleavened bread. So they eat various herbs and things like that. And there are different, interpretations given to why these things are eaten, to show the bitterness of their suffering and stuff like that. So notice that there's no lamb or goat on the table. You notice this? There's no meat. But didn't I say that they sacrificed a lamb or a goat? They smeared its blood, and that's the sacrifice, right? Then they boil its flesh and eat it. They don't. What's going on here? Well, they can't, because remember what happened in 70 AD. And we talked about the history. It's messy. What happened in Jewish history in 70 AD? What? You do not remember. Look in your notes. If you don't know it I don't remember a lot of things, and I go on the internet, I go on Wikipedia, I look in the books in my library, and give her a second, Mr. Frizio. Suchia. Yes. What do you got? The temple, yes. What happened to the temple? It fell? Is that what you're saying? Yeah, it was destroyed, right? The Romans destroyed it, right? I told you that. Yeah, 70 AD. It's a major date in Jewish history. Didn't I tell you that? Powerful. The Jewish temple lays in ruins to this day. The Romans destroyed it, 70 AD. So if the temple is destroyed, how can the Jews sacrifice, where can they bring their lambs and goats to be sacrificed for the Passover? They can't. And they can't do it in their homes because you could only offer sacrifice in their temple. So they can't do it anymore. So there's no actual lamb or goat that's eaten during the Passover. Just bread and herbs and stuff like that, and lots of wine. Oh, I mentioned that. Okay. Of course, I'm not going to tell you everything about the Passover ceremony. The ceremony is described as a Seder, and we should remember that word from the Talmud, the Shas, the Shishas Sedarim, right? The 6 orders. And that's all Seder means. It's the order of service for Jewish worship. Okay? So like your liturgy book that you use for the service of the service of the Passover. It's a Seder. Okay? So in the Seder, the order, it'll give you all the prayers and the stories that they'll retell. They'll, of course, retell the story from the Exodus about, the night God passed over Egypt and how they left Egypt. And at one time, usually the youngest child, I think it is, will ask a series of questions of the father, yes, the youngest child. And one of those questions, why is this night different from other nights? Which cues up the father to then repeat the story and remember the story of the Exodus and what happened, how God saved their people from slavery, from oppression. Traditionally, during the Passover, they leave a chair empty at the table with a glass of wine. This is for the prophet Elijah, one of the Jewish prophets who Jews believe will come at the end of the world, at the end of time. And he will be the herald or the proclaimer of the Messianic age, the coming of the Messiah or the Christ. Okay? And I think they also go outside. They open the door as well to welcome Elijah if he does come and stuff like that. So they do symbolic stuff like that during the Passover. Now we get to King David. This man, King David. And God makes a covenant with him. And if you're curious about his story, then there's where you can look in the Jewish scriptures. And what is the covenant with David? God promises this King David, who's not remember, he's not the first king of Israel, but he's the greatest king. God makes a covenant with him that his kingdom will never end, that it will go on forever, which, as we know from Jewish history, it did not. It eventually ended. And so the Jews had to explain that, and they came up with the idea that, well, God will reestablish it in the future. Another anointed one will come in the future. Anointed one meaning Messiah. So this idea of the Messiah being promised through David, a descendant of David who will come back and reestablish the kingdom, and safety from their enemies. The kingdom will establish, God promises that he will give peace. The Davidic monarchy will be the agent through which God will fulfill Israel's destiny, giving them peace from their surrounding enemies so they can live in peace and follow the law of God. What are the obligations? Well, that's a question. What are the obligations? If you read, for example, did I give this? It's Psalm 89, but I didn't put that on the PowerPoint. Oh, yeah, I did. If you want to read the promise of the covenant, you look to the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, in the Tanakh, where God sends a prophet to David and says, basically makes this covenant with David, this promise. But there's no real obligations attached to it. It's just God's going to do it of his own initiative. So it's a question mark what God is really requiring David to do. So I guess it's assumed that he'll be a faithful king and that his children will be faithful kings. But even if they're not, God tells David, I'll just beat them with the rod and kind of like bring them back into line, but I'll never break my agreement with you. All right, fine. So it's just a question mark. We're not sure what the obligations are of this covenant. And would anyone like to read this? This is Psalm 89 in the Jewish scriptures, the book of Psalms. These are songs, Jewish songs, sometimes many of them probably associated with the temple worship. Some of them might have been sung in the court of the king, for the king. But this Psalm 89, this is kind of like a repeat of God's covenant that I mentioned to you in the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, which might actually be more original. It's in poetic form, more original than the historical account, the historical repetition of the giving of the prophecy of the covenant. But would anyone like to read this section? I got you. Ms. Ramnath, go ahead. Sorry.
For I got that my I made to David my servant. I will make your dynasty stand forever and establish your throne for all Egypt. Then you, God, spoke into Egypt, since perfect ones, he said, I have set a leader over the warrior. I have raised up the chosen one from the people. I have chosen David, my servant, with my whole heart.
Excellent. Okay. So these are just selections, verses from a longer, the psalm is longer than this. But notice, I think the point is kind of made. It specifies David, God's servant, is the chosen one. God's going to make his dynasty last forever. Okay. And the idea of Messiah comes into play because it talks about that God has anointed him with holy oil, and the Hebrew word, the verb is meshapiu, from which we get the word Messiah. Okay, the anointed one, the Christ. I have Christed him, you could say, but I've anointed him with oil. That's how they translate it here. Which is part of the process of making a king in ancient Israel. You pour oil all over his head and it will flow down his body. which is a symbol of his installation as the king. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything here. I mean, originally it probably just means I have anointed him the king. I've poured oil over him and made him the king of Israel. But Jews will later read this as kind of like a prophecy of the later anointed one who comes from David, the Messiah, okay, will come, who God has also anointed to reestablish David's kingdom. So the covenant, God's special agreement, part of the covenant I mentioned was a law. God gives a law to the Jews. He kind of gives a law to Abraham, but really one thing, just circumcise your kids, okay? Not much more specific than that. But then with, Moses, you get all sorts of laws and commandments, okay? Then if we go back, just to go back for a moment to the Tanakh, oops. I mean, Abraham's story and Jacob's story, their stories are in Genesis. But all the rest of this, Exodus to Deuteronomy, is all Moses. It's all Moses. It's all talking about the Exodus, of course, and then their laws for worship in the Exodus. Leviticus gives many more laws to the priests. Numbers, and then Deuteronomy, okay, is a second giving of the law. So you see how important Moses is and the kind of like the shadow he casts over Judaism, okay? You just have the one book where you have some stories about Abraham and his children, but all the rest of it is the Mosaic law. The heart of the Mosaic law is something you may have heard of called the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments, which is a little bit different than Hulk Hogan's 3 Demandments, which is exercise, take your vitamins, and say your prayers. But there's your definition. A list of essential guidelines for human conduct that their God gave to the Jews. And these are 10 laws, brief laws, proclaimed by God to Moses. And scholars think that the 10 Commandments really embody the earliest laws of the Hebrews, the earliest, most basic laws of the Hebrew community. Okay? Traditionally, they're ascribed to Moses, but, scholars think that they probably developed over centuries. I don't know how many centuries you need to develop just 10 commandments. Thou shalt not lie, Mr. Whitehawk. I mean, how many centuries do you need to figure that one out,
Apparently more than we know.
Considering our present history, sure, I mean, look at thou shalt not kill, and we're still killing. Anyways. There are 2 versions of the 10 Commandments, basically a repeat. The first version is in Exodus, the book of Exodus, and then the second version is in Deuteronomy. And even though the scholars think that the book of Deuteronomy came later, they think that the version in Deuteronomy is probably the earlier version than Exodus, which contains earlier stories. But they're basically the same. I mean, you can look at them for yourselves if you want, but they're basically the same. There's really very little difference between the two. Moses, according to the story, Moses goes up a mountain to be with God. He's alone with God, and he receives two tablets of stone with the Torah and the commandments on it. Okay? Uh-oh. Off she goes. Notice what I said. The Torah, including the commandments. So you might say to yourself, well, wait a second. Didn't he say there was like the Torah, the oral Torah, and the written Torah is like these 5 books and stuff on 2 stone tablets. Moses got all of that, even the oral Torah, like the Mishnah and stuff, and the Talmud. The Talmud is multiple volumes. Yes. Yes, if you are a conservative or Orthodox, well, probably an Orthodox Jew or a very traditional Jew, yes, you believe that it was all just given to Moses on these tablets all at once, both the written and the oral Torah. So it's not just the written law of God, but also it contains the oral law as well, written on these stone tablets. He's God. I guess he can do whatever he wants. And why are there 2 tablets? Who knows? But some scholars think, well, that's how you did a contract in the ancient world. You had a copy of the contract, and each side had a copy, an exact copy. Well, you had the original contract, but you had a copy of the contract. So that might be why it talks about 2 tablets. So God has his copy of the law. And the Israelites have their copy of the law. Another word for the 10 Commandments is the Decalogue. So I give it to you. Another name for the 10 Commandments, which comes from Greek deca and logos, which literally means 10 words. And that's what it's called. It never actually specifies. When God gives these laws to Moses, God doesn't call them the 10 Commandments, or they're not called the 10 Commandments. And the way that they're organized, you can actually have as many as 15 commandments if you just take it according to the imperatives that are given. Do this, do not do that. 10 is kind of conventional. It fits, all right? It doesn't have to be 10. You can organize them differently, okay? You can have more than 10. However, later on, I think in the book of Deuteronomy, it gives the name that the Jews use for it. They call it the 10 words, the 10 words. Okay, and that's where we get this idea of 10 commandments or the Decalogue from. All right, so you do find it in the Bible, this idea very early on of 10 ideas, 10 things you're supposed to do or not do. Although literally they're not really 10 words. They're more than 10 words, even for the 10 commandments. But that's just a name that's given to them, the conventional name. Oop.
Moses west of the mountain, God spoke to him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. What? What? Oh, Lord, why have you chosen me? You have chosen. I tell you, and you shall take. Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy. Hear me! Oh, hear me! Oh, pray ye! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 15. 10 commandments for all to obey.
Anyone know what that is? What movie that is? Anybody? No? History of the World Part 2 by Mel Brooks. Anyways. Yeah, that's kind of, so he's being comical with, I got you, Mr. Belfield. He's being kind of funny about it. Moses comes down with 15, but he breaks one of the tablets and says, but he's clever. So, he's like, no, don't notice that. It's 10 commandments, But that's actually, it's funny in a way because it's actually what happens in the biblical story. When Moses comes down with the first set of commandments, he finds that the Israelites have actually lost the faith. They've made an idol and they're worshiping other gods. They've already lost their faith in Yahweh. And Moses becomes furious and he smashes the commandments, the first copies of the commandments. And an earthquake ensues and kills all the people who apostatize and whatnot. And Moses then has to go up the mountain again to ask the Lord, I mean, with a lot of egg on his face, to ask Lord again, could you write those down again? Because I kind of broke them before. And so God writes them down again for Moses. Yes, Mr. Belfield.
Is that what prophets would say? Like they'd actually like hear God's voice and have a conversation?
Well, I don't know because I'm not a prophet. I've never had that experience. I can only tell you from how if the prophets almost never describe their experience. Okay, it just the word of the Lord came to so and so, or the Lord laid his hand on so and so, almost like a burden. And that's how prophecy is described. It's like a burden, like God's pushing you down. So, I mean, yeah, maybe they hear something in their heads, or they hear voice or words or something, ideas. I don't know. They don't explain it a lot. Sometimes there's a description of what happens, like the prophet Isaiah describes a vision where he sees God, or what he thinks is God, in the temple. He was a priest in the temple, Isaiah. So he thinks that he has a vision. So that's how he receives his prophecy. Other descriptions of the prophets in the Jewish writings, they're kind of like psychics or astrologers. They sit in front of a pot, they inhale the fumes, and they see things, or they feel inspired or moved to say things for people. So they're kind of almost like that. I don't want to say psychic, or like a shaman. No, well, a shaman's not a good word either. It's the word I'm looking for. I want to say Wicca or witchcraft, because that's not really it either. But you get what I'm saying. They would go into a trance, kind of omantic prophets, or sometimes called mantism, from the word for being crazy from Greek. That's really what it is. They act crazy. They go into trances and say things and do things in the name of the God. And so sometimes that's how the Israelite prophets act. So yeah, there are different things. Different ways. Sometimes they can say they hear stuff. Other times they can say they see stuff. Other times they kind of create the experience by, as I said, inhaling who knows what, wink, wink, inhaling stuff, or just making, doing things that will make them go into a trance. You don't need drugs for that. You can, sit in front of a fire for hours on end and, in a sweat house, and you can start hallucinating. So they would do stuff like that, apparently. Not go to sweat houses, but they would do certain practices that would allow them to have contact with their God and maybe open their minds so they could have a vision or an inspiration or something. Yeah. All right. Here are the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy, which I told you were the oldest, probably older. Does anyone want to read this from Deuteronomy chapter 5? Anybody? Oh, Ms. Francis.
Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, you decrees which I proclaim in your hearing this day, that ye may learn them and take care to observe them. The Lord our God made a covenant with us. The Lord spoke with you face to face on the mountain from the midst of the fire. Since you were afraid of the fire and would not go up the mountain, I stood between the Lord and you to announce to you these words of the Lord. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Take care to keep holy the Sabbath day, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. For remember that you too were once slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you from there with his strong hand and outstretched arm. That is the way the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Honor your father and mother as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear dishonest witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not desire your neighbor's house or field, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or ass, nor anything that belongs to him. These words and nothing more the Lord spoke with a loud voice to your entire assembly on the mountain in the midst of the fire and dense cloud, and wrote them upon 2 tablets of stone and gave them to me.
Okay, very good. Now, the way we can tell that this is an earlier version as opposed to the one in Exodus, even though the book of Exodus or the material in Exodus is probably earlier than Deuteronomy, is think about the Sabbath here, about keeping the Sabbath holy, the third commandment, we can number it. Because I'm reading here from Exodus 20 from my Bible. Just remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. 6 days you may labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. Okay, so basically the same. You shall not do any work, either of you, your son. You should not do work, either of you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your work animal, or the resident alien within your gates. Okay? Why? For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but on the 7th day he rested. That is why Yahweh has blessed the 7th day and made it holy. Okay, so you see there's a different explanation given than is given here in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, it reminds them, it's a reminder you were once slaves working in Egypt, okay, and God saved you, all right? But in Exodus, it mentions that God, the 6 days in which God made the world, and the 7th day he rested, which is, and if anyone knows from your Bible class or whatever, your confirmation class, if you're Christian or Catholic, that's Genesis chapter 1. The story in Genesis chapter 1, the opening chapter of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God creates the earth in 6 days. 7th day he's finished with his work as a laborer, and so he rests. Well, scholars pretty much agree that that story is an add-on. It's a much later addition to the book of Genesis, a much later tradition within the Jewish sacred writings. So the fact that that's the reason given in Exodus kind of pinpoints that this might be a later version of the Ten Commandments because it gives a later reason or rationale than Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy, even though the book of Deuteronomy was probably written later than Exodus, it preserves an older tradition than Exodus does just because of the reason for why the Sabbath is given. Okay? All right, so here they are, these 10 commandments, the words, it doesn't say 10 words, but the words that God gives on these 2 tablets, okay? And what do they enjoin? The 10 commandments are the essential statement of God's relationship with Israel. Everything else flows from this. It starts with the relationship between the Israelites and their God, but notice most of it is dealing with the relationship amongst themselves and with each other. Family relationships with your neighbor, other Israelites. So what do they enjoin? Worshiping, the first one is probably obvious, a non-negotiable for the Lord, which is you worship only the Lord God. He's the only God of the Jews. You keep the 7th day of the week. That's what Shabbat means in Hebrew. It means the number 7, 7th. So the 7th is literally what it's saying. Take care to keep holy the 7th, which they translate as the Sabbath day. You could also translate it as the 7th day. So the 7th day of the week. Why? Okay, the reason here is then, as I said in Exodus, is different, but it doesn't matter. God wants it. So as a Jew, you're obliged to keep it. Honoring your parents. Okay, so your family, there's a family, whatchamacallit, your relationship with family members. Okay, so God, then relationship with your family members, then relationship with other people. Right? Comes after that. 5 till 10. I also noticed that, some of the commandments are positive and most of them are negative. But, this is positive. And I guess this is not positive. Don't have other gods except me. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain, which means, don't take a false oath. If you're going to take an oath in the name of God, don't lie when you're doing it. Fulfill your oath. Be truthful. Certainly don't use God's name as a curse word or anything like that, as foul language. And this comes to be understood as don't even pronounce the name of God. even that could be seen as disrespectful. Okay? Now, this is a positive one. Keep holy the Sabbath. Okay, do this. Honor your father and mother. Do that. And then the rest are all negative. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Don't kill. Don't murder people. That's how it's been interpreted. It doesn't mean don't kill at all, because if you've ever read the Bible, Ms. Winko, the Jews do a lot of killing. In fact, God tells them to do a lot of killing. So it's usually interpreted as murder. Don't kill the innocent, those that you don't have the authority to kill. Don't take other people's stuff that you're not allowed to. Theft, stealing. Don't sleep with someone don't have sex with someone you're not supposed to have sexual relations with, like another person's wife or husband. Okay? Don't lie. Don't be a false witness. Okay? Which is extended to don't tell an untruth, but the main concern there was the court system. You needed people to be truthful in the court system. They're archaic as it was, but you needed witnesses to be not lying in order to know who needs to be punished or not, who's innocent and who's guilty. So don't be a false witness in a court case, but it also extends to just don't be untruthful or lie. And don't covet. Don't desire more than God gives you. Okay, so not just don't have sex with someone's other wife, your neighbor's wife, but don't even covet or desire, or just don't desire your neighbor's stuff, like his house, his slaves, his animals, anything that belongs. I'll pass over the thing about slaves. That you have human beings as property, but that was part of the culture. It is kind of nice, though, that, the wife is in Commandment 9, don't covet your neighbor's wife. But if you read the book of Exodus, she's part of Commandment 10, lumped in with the slaves and the farm animals and the property. So at least there seems to be some kind of development in the dignity of women that occurs by the time that this is written down, or whatever, that is in Deuteronomy. But anyways, yeah. What else do I want to say about that? Oh, if you read the Hebrew, all of these, because the verbs in certain languages, like the Semitic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, they distinguish between whether the speaker is a male or a female, or the person being spoken to is male or female in the verbs. So the verbs change if the speaker is a woman or a man, right? So in these commandments, the commands are in the masculine form. So we know that every one of these commandments that God is giving is being directed to the men in the community, not to the women. So you could look at it negatively, like, oh, that's very, patriarchal or male focused. But on the other hand, you could look at it in another way, like God knew where the problem lied, or God knew which group of people he was going to have problems with and needed laws to kind of restrain them. You didn't need to worry about the other group so much. Anyways. But it's probably because it was a male-oriented society, so why would God speak to women, Although he does speak to women sometimes in the Jewish scriptures. Nevertheless. So these commandments were written on stone. Oh, I already mentioned that. Okay, so these are the foundational principles of Jewish community life. There are many more commandments that God gives after this. Okay, but these are the start, the basis. The law begins. The apex of the giving of the law is the giving of these 10 rules, these 10 words, and everything is basically based off of these ideas. Okay? So that's the law. Part of the law is the Sabbath. Okay? The Sabbath. It's one of the commandments of God. And Jews are obliged to follow the commandments. Okay? So one of the main religious commandments, because the other commandments aren't necessarily religious, that you honor the gods. Find that's common in religions. Honor your parents. That's common throughout society, not religion. Don't kill, tell the truth, don't steal. Okay, you don't really need a God to tell you that, right, Mr. Whitehawk? You don't. Yeah, can know that, I would think. But the Sabbath, no, that's unique to Judaism. That one day of the week you use it to honor your God. That was unique to Jews. That there was this one day of the week that they would not do any work. That's the Sabbath. And the theological interpretation, as I read to you from the book of Exodus, this later interpretation was that since God rested on the rested on the seventh day of the week from all of his work of creating the universe, Jews imitate that by resting on the seventh day of the week as well. So it's looking back. And a lot of religions do this. You see this in a lot of religions where there's kind of looking back towards the beginning, pristine, perfect period of time at the beginning before everything goes wrong. So in the case of Judaism, it's the Garden of Eden where the first humans, Adam and Eve, are living in paradise, happy, no problems, okay? Living with God in paradise. So it looks back to that time. But it also looks forward to the Messianic age when the Messiah will come and reestablish the paradise. Okay, so there are two foci of the Sabbath observance, going backwards to Eden, but also going forwards to the kingdom of the Messiah. As I told you, the word Sabbath, Shabbat, okay, means seventh, Shevi'i, seventh. The root meaning of the word Shabbat is really to cease, to stop doing something, to cease, to desist, but also to destroy. But this idea of stopping existence, destroying, but ceasing or stopping, so Shabbat, related to the word for seventh, as I said. Okay? So, I mean, you have to understand how Jews think when they interpret things. Because we have what the word probably comes from, Shabbat, which means to stop. So it's a day where you stop working. So Shabbat. But it also sounds like seventh, Shevi'i. So they connected up with the seventh day when God rested. He stopped working on the seventh day. So you have kind of this mixture of ideas going on. And the idea of the Sabbath probably influenced how the story about the creation of the world was told. So of course God rests on the seventh, Shabbat, Shevi'i. They're very similar, in sound. So on the Sabbath, there are all sorts of rules, and these are covered in the Talmud, minute rules about what you can do, what you can't do. Certainly you can't work at a job, so you can't do what's called servile work, so you can't work your job. That's forbidden. But anything that would approximate work is also forbidden. So when we looked at the Talmud, we looked at an example of cooking. Can you cook on the Sabbath? No, you can't. Okay, but does cooking include, Ms. Rayner, just heating up food? Is that cooking? Or keeping food warm? Ms. Boris, excuse me. Keeping food warm. Can you turn on lights, during the Sabbath? Can you walk somewhere? If you can go out walking, how far can you walk before it's considered work? Okay. So if you ever live near a Jewish community with Orthodox Jews and stuff, you might sometimes on Saturdays see them walking around. And, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you have to figure out where you're going to live. You have to know where the synagogue is. You have to be nearby, near enough that on the Sabbath you can walk there, because you can't drive, because it's an internal combustion engine, which, it makes a spark and fire, okay, which moves the stuff in the engine and makes the car move. You can't do that because you're not allowed to make fire on the Sabbath. That would be work. So you can't use an internal combustion engine. So you have to walk, but you can't walk too far. I forget how far it is, a couple of miles or something in total. But you can't walk too far. So you have to figure out if, where you're going to put by your house and live, so that you're close enough that every day on the Sabbath you can walk to and from the synagogue without breaking the commandment of God. So what's work? Usually, whatever you do in your house or can do in your house, and there are ways to kind of, I don't want to say break the law. If you read the textbook, you know what I'm talking about. They talk about building a fence around the law, a fence around Torah, so that you don't even come close to violating the law. So you build a fence so you don't do something else that's related to maybe the practice. Okay, so for example, whatchamacallit? Well, something pops into my head. But anyways, it's called building a fence. But sometimes it seems like it's almost like to kind of get around the law in a way, to not follow it. Like if you're in your home, there are things you can do in your home that you're not usually allowed to do on the Sabbath outside. Okay, because you're in your home. Let's say for walking. You got to walk around your home, right? I mean, you're walking around your house. But what if you walk around a lot? What if you're walking around your house a lot, and if you added up all your steps, you've got a Fitbit or something, and you add up all your steps, it comes out to like 3 miles that you walked around your house. Did you just break the law? Did you just, because you worked on the Sabbath, you walked more than 2 miles? Well, no, I was in my home, in my house. Okay, if I had done it outside, walking to the store, walking somewhere, anywhere, no, that would be different, because that's outside of the home. But if it's in the home, it's okay. All right. So typically, like another example would be like pushing a baby stroller. If you have a baby or a little child and you want to take the child out on the Sabbath, can you push the kid in a stroller? Well, typically, no, that's work. Pushing the stroller is considered work, so that would violate the Sabbath. So you can't do it. But can you do it inside your home? Oh, yeah, you could do that. So what we need to do, Ms. Oler, is somehow extend the home outside the home. Because then, and if I could do that, then I can do things outside the home, the physical home, that I can do inside. And it wouldn't be breaking the law. It wouldn't be breaking because the rules are different inside the home, yes? You can do things inside the home on the Sabbath that you can't do things outside. So what Orthodox Jews will do, and you'll see this sometimes in their neighborhoods. Well, you won't see this sometimes. You probably will see this in their neighborhoods. But sometimes they extend it out even beyond their neighborhoods to local parks and stuff like that. You'll see a wire that's kind of strung along the telephone poles. It's called an eruv. And if it's attached to a person's home, then it's considered like the whole area that the eruv goes around in the neighborhood or wherever is now part of the home. So now you can push your baby in the stroller up and down the street during the Sabbath, as long as you stay within the boundaries of the eruv. Now you can walk to the park, which might be 3 miles away, which technically will be maybe breaking the Sabbath. But if there's an eruv, it's an extension of your home. So you're not breaking the Sabbath technically. You're doing what you can do in your home. So there are ways to build a fence around the Torah, and I think also maybe kind of get around some of the rules, So anyways. Kashrut. This will be the last thing I'll talk about. Actually, a number of things to say about it. It's very complicated as well. I'll start talking about it, and I'll come back to it on Thursday. But kashrut is another thing that is a large part of Jewish life. What kind of foods a Jew can eat and not what foods a Jew should not eat. It's not mentioned in the 10 Commandments. You'll notice there's no commandment about thou shalt not eat shrimp, thou shalt not eat the pig, stuff like that. This comes from later laws that are attached onto or given to Moses. And basically, all kosher means in Hebrew is what is acceptable to eat. Okay, so kasher in Hebrew literally means something that's straight, correct, or right, but it comes to have the idea of acceptable. So kosher, or the laws of kosher, which are called kashrut, mean just those foods, and not just foods, but other practices like how you sew your clothes or make clothes. I have that in the brain, because you also, how you plant your crops, all sorts of things. You want to do it in the correct way, the appropriate, the acceptable way. And God tells you, he gives certain rules for it. This is the appropriate way to plant your crops. This is the appropriate way to make clothing. This is the appropriate food to eat. It's kosher. So it doesn't just apply to food, but it's kashrut or kosher is mainly applied to the system for determining and maintaining the ritual purity of food. It doesn't ritual purity. It doesn't mean that pigs are necessarily dirty animals or disgusting animals or whatever. They just don't meet the guidelines for something that's acceptable to eat. You know, doesn't mean they're not filling. I mean, I love pigs. I mean, I wish they didn't taste so good because they're so cute too. I mean, I love them. They're cute little animals, but I'm sorry, they taste good. So I hope I'm really pushing for these people in the labs who are growing synthetic meat, because then I won't have a reason to eat animals anymore. Nevertheless, it is what it is. Oh, we're done, Ms. Winko? You're sending me on. Okay, you're right, Ms. Winko. God bless you all. I'll see you on Thursday. Come back to this.
Thank you.
You're welcome, miss. Have a good day.